I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You're listening to Alaska Matters Radio. I'm Christopher Story, your host for great adventures in this last frontier. That was Mr. David Freeman, Alaskan musician and friend of mine, who put together the anthem in a way that I had to share with you. Thank you, David. That was amazing. Dave Webb is your engineer and producer up at the mothership of KPEN FM 102. In a moment, we'll say hello again to our good friend Brad Keithley with Keithley Consulting and bgkeithley.com, the only blog and news organization you need to know if you're curious about what's going on with gas and oil in the state of Alaska. And when I'm confused, I call Brad, and Brad usually says, all right, fine, I will suffer you, fool, for just a moment. And he'll do that momentarily. Alaskan Mindbender brought to you by Blackwater Bend Espresso. When good won't do, get gourmet brew. It's what I do. What am I, Dr. Seuss? Good grief, what's happening? Well, I want you to be able to go for free. We've already given away one gift certificate to Jim and Jan Preston. The question is as follows. We're going to visit the land of NIMBY. Not in my backyard, you say. Well, would you support a community-wide ban of commercial pot? So we're talking about cultivation, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about retail sales, and yes, we're talking about the dirty little word of taxation. You're going to forego all of those green bills coming in off those green buds. Are you in support of it? Jana and Jim said, yeah, they'd support a ban. What about you? One more gift card giveaway to Blackwater Bend Espresso. Text me your thoughts and answer at 299-7653. 299-7653. Please help me welcome Brad Keithley with Keithley Consulting and the publisher of Thoughts on Oil on Gas, found at bgkeithley.com. Brad, you testified before the Senate Affairs Committee about 4 or 5 days ago. In a nutshell, can you tell me why you were there and what was the result of that?
Chris, I was there because some of the proposals, most of the proposals for dealing with the fiscal crisis that the governor has proposed and have been introduced into legislation or introduced as legislation call for significant reductions in the permanent fund dividend. I don't think that's the right direction for Alaska to take. I think we've got more spending cuts we can make, and I think we have enough savings that we can get through this low cycle in oil prices and come out the other side without having to go to PFD cuts or taxes. So I was asked to go down there by Senator Stoltz and give testimony on that issue.
Well, first of all, that's a compelling argument. How do you think you were received by the committee?
I think the committee, for the most part, appreciated the testimony. After the testimony, both Senator Huggins and Senator Wielechowski separately said they agreed with my point that we were rushing into something that we didn't know whether we needed to do. Senator McGuire has a bill up that does exactly what I was testifying against, which is her bill is cuts PFDs significantly, and I don't think she was too pleased with my testimony.
Right.
In fact, she testified today, and I understand my name came up several times. So I may not have gotten her, but I think Senator Huggins, Senator Stoltz, Senator Coghill, and I think Senator Wielechowski reacted well to it.
All right, Brad. Speaker of the House Mike Chenault said early on in this debate, once this before the session started, look, we cannot cut our way to prosperity. And he was conceding there's going to have to be some new revenues. And what you and I both know new revenues means is taxation is going to come in one form or another. This is according to Speaker of the House Mike Chenault. So first of all, though, before we get into taxing and cutting and or capping the dividend and or tapping into the permanent fund, Brad, how did Alaska get to a $5 billion annual budget? And are there any circumstances under which you could see tapping the permanent fund as a solution? But how did we get here to $5 billion a year?
Well, we got here by lack of fiscal discipline from about 2007 on. If you take the 2006 budget, which was passed in 2005, and escalate it or adjust it for inflation and population growth, you come out to a budget of about $4 billion, a little over $4 billion. The reason we have a budget much higher than that, 25% higher than that, is because we lacked fiscal discipline when taxes were raised and when oil prices were high. We adopted new programs. We started spending on new things. We built new facilities that we have to maintain. And we let spending get out of hand in the intervening 10 years. So that's how we got to this situation. The way to get out of it is the exact reverse, is to cut spending back to those levels by undoing the programs we got ourselves into and going back and relooking at the types of things that we adopted during that period.
You mentioned a combination of cuts and relying on reserves we've already got. Are the reserves you're referring to in the Constitutional Budget Reserve?
There's two sets of reserves, and frankly, this is where I think where I think Speaker Chenault may be going. There's the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which is about $7 billion or so. And then there's a portion of the permanent fund earnings that are set aside, frankly, for government. They've been accumulated over time, but under Jay Hammond's vision and Clem Tillion's vision, they were to be there to be used when government was no longer able to rely solely on oil. And that's about another $7 billion or so. So we have somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 billion that we can use to call on to get us through this low cycle, this low part of the oil price cycle, rather than capping the PFD or going to taxes.
You're listening to Alaska Matters Radio. I'm Chris Story along with Brad Keithley. Brad is the publisher of Thoughts on Oil and Gas, bgkeithley.com, KeithLey.com. Brad, so I hear you. Okay, so we spent our way into the $5 billion. We've got 14 some odd billion dollars in a reserve that could stay over the period of time that oil is at this incredibly low price per barrel. What about increasing production? What about increasing the volume in taps as well as exploration and new finds and these kinds of things, growing that top line? So if we're going to be doing the best we can, presumably, to cut, and then what about growing? What could we do differently as a state, as a government, to encourage and or entice or get more oil flowing through the pipeline?
Well, Chris, you and I talked during the Senate Bill 21 campaign, during the Proposition 1 campaign about this a lot. And frankly, we did a lot when we passed Senate Bill 21. It reduces taxes on oil production and incentivizes investment here in Alaska as opposed to investment elsewhere. And frankly, it's worked. Alaska has not suffered in terms of investment dollars, oil and gas investment dollars coming into the state, has not suffered nearly as much as other parts of the country because Senate Bill 21 attracted a lot of dollars here, both before and during the early part of this oil price crash. Now, with the oil price crash, companies are cutting back on investment everywhere. They're cutting to the bone in order to have enough money to fund dividends and pay debt. So Alaska is not attracting as much investment as we did, but we're still attracting a lot. So that sort of investment is going to pay off, has been paying off, and will continue to pay off in new production. The second piece is the Alaska LNG project. That's a critically important part of Alaska's future, not only from the standpoint of jobs, but more importantly from the standpoint of revenue. And I think the fact that the three private companies that are involved in that project, BP, Exxon, and Conoco, are still investing in it, still have their people up here working on it, even in this where they're cutting back everywhere else in the world, is evidence that this project has a lot of potential. So that's the second piece of getting our production back up.
You're listening to Chris Story and Brad Keithley, mostly Brad Keithley. Thank God. He's the one that understands this stuff, and I'm just asking some questions. And I'm going to ask him when we return, flip side, if we had ACES today versus the SB 21 that was successful and Prop 1 was defeated and SB 21 lived. If we had ACES today, where would we be? We'll talk about that. And are new taxes inevitable? Are you going to see an income tax in Alaska no matter what? That and more here on Alaska Matters Radio. You're listening to Alaska Matters Radio. I'm Christopher Story along with David Webb. We're bringing you what my mom calls the greatest show on earth. Blackwater Bend Espresso has an Alaskan Mindbender question for you, and I'll ask it again, and then we'll go back to our friend Brad Keithley with bgkeithley.com. The publication is Thoughts on Oil and Gas. It's basically, if you've got a question about what's going on in Alaska surrounding gas and oil, well, that's the website you go to. All right, the question on the table, we're visiting the land of NIMBY, and I'm wondering, would you support a ban on commercial marijuana cultivation, manufacturing, and retail sales in your community? Jim and Jan have already won one gift card, and we have one more to give away. Share your thoughts and opinion on that right now at 299-7653. 299-7653. So, Brad, you're still a proponent of at what SB 21 did, but let me ask you to prognosticate, if you will, on where would Alaska be today, in your opinion, if we were still living under ACES?
We'd be going backwards in two respects. One, we wouldn't have the investment that we've had up on the slope. That investment would have gone elsewhere, where it cost the producers less to produce, and they would have gotten more revenue elsewhere. So SB 21 encouraged investment. We're better off because of that. And on the tax end, SB 21 contained an alternative minimum tax that ACES didn't. And frankly, if we didn't have that alternative minimum tax enacted as part of SB 21, we would have no oil revenue today, because under ACES, the prices have dropped to the point where there would have been no tax or production tax on the oil. So SB 21 both has brought us more investment, more jobs, more production down the line, and it's brought us more current revenue as a result of the alternative minimum tax.
I need to repeat that, or ask you to repeat that, because I did take, you mentioned, you and I spoke at length during the debate on the proposition that would have repealed SB 21, returned Alaska to ACES. I took some grief on that, and in fact, had quite a few emails. One in particular said, this gentleman worked for Jay Hammond, and how dare I mean, really a vicious attack on my support of SB 21. And I just need to hear it again. You're suggesting that under ACES, we'd not only see a diminished amount of taxation coming into the Alaskan coffers, maybe none at the current rate of oil?
Absolutely. ACES did not have an alternative minimum tax. That was one of the trade-offs under ACES for the very high tax rates. Once oil passed $100, the trade-off was there wasn't a minimum tax. So if oil prices went down, there came a point where you had no taxation. That happened about $40. What SB 21 did is lower the rate of taxation at the higher end, which encouraged investment and continues to encourage investment. And in exchange for that, it had an alternative minimum tax at the low end to cushion the state in the event prices went low. So SB 21's turned out to be, frankly, the savior of having some continued production tax during this time of low prices.
Can I get a hallelujah? Okay, excellent. Let's move on to income taxes. In my view, in my worldview, I'm always looking for the red herring and thinking, wait a minute, is cutting the PFD or the potential threat of capping or cutting the PFD a way of making more palatable a statewide sales or income tax? Do you think there could be any credence to the idea that no matter what, we're going to see some kind of a statewide tax invoked either on income or on sales and sales tax? I mean, is it just inevitable, Brad?
Chris, I don't think so. First of all, cutting the PFD is an income tax. The PFD is income to each Alaskan. It's their share of the oil wealth produced from state lands off the North Slope. When Jay Hammond and Clem and others set it up, they intended that part of that wealth would go into the private sector in Alaska through the hands of Alaskans. Taking that away, cutting the PFD, to me, is an income tax. You're cutting the income of Alaskans. I don't think we need to go there. As I testified before the legislature, and if people are interested in seeing my slide deck, it's on the website. When I testified before the legislature, I testified that we're in a very the low end of a commodity cycle. We have these cycles in the oil industry from time to time. We have very highs up in the $140 range. Then we have lows. We're at the low end. We need patience. We're going to come out of this. We have enough fiscal reserves to be able to get ourselves out of this if we cut spending down to sustainable levels, and ride through this cycle and ride up through the next high. Hopefully, in the next high, we'll save some to get us ready for the low that comes after that. But I don't think we need to panic. I don't think we need to run to the other side of the ship and say we need to take income of Alaskans and in order to support the government sector, either through PFD cuts, which is an income tax, or through more progressive income taxes of the type we know at the federal level.
I would love to see, Brad, a change of mindset amongst all Alaskans, be they municipal, like you in Anchorage, the big metro of Anchorage, or little far-flung rural communities, whereby we don't look to state government to be stupid with our money. In other words, for example, we just, in our little community of Homer, our lovely little hamlet by the sea, we just spent about $900,000 with state dollars acquiring a 2-acre tract, of which we need about 60 feet off of the top length of it to expand a little bit of a roadway that's going to cost another probably $2 million coming from the state, in a time when we can no further afford it as a state than can somebody who's absolutely going finally for Chapter 11 to go out to a 5-star dinner. We just can't afford it, and yet we're doing it, and we're planning for these other capital expenditures without regard. And then further, we're using state dollars to take taxable lands off of the tax rolls. And so it's cutting both ways. And I'm hopeful that while we're in this low, that we also change our thought process and maybe approach capital projects a little bit differently. You think that's reasonable or even possible?
Well, I'm hopeful with you in that regard. We spent like drunken sailors during the period when we had high revenues, when we were at the high end of the commodity cycle. Anchorage has an AstroTurf football field almost for every high school. We built this new $100 million athletic arena at UAA. We've built 2 new engineering schools. We built a medical or a health sciences building at UAA. We've built other things at UAF. We just went on a spending binge throughout the state. We built an aquatic center in Bethel that has to be air conditioned 24/7, 365 days a year, or else it will melt into the tundra. We went on this spending binge, and hopefully we have learned our lesson. The commodities go high and commodities go low, and when they're high, you need to set aside a lot for saving for the time period when they're low. There's ICER has done studies on what that line is, what the sustainable budget line is, and we need to observe it going forward. But right now, I think people are recognizing that we shouldn't be spending, increasingly recognizing that we shouldn't be spending capital dollars on things that are not needed items.
All right. Well, Brad Keithley, the website, bgkeithley.com, bgkeithley.com, and I'll put a link on my website as well. Brad, just briefly summarize for us, please, what's the lowest oil will go per barrel, in your opinion, and how long before Alaskans start to feel optimistic again statewide?
Well, I can do the latter one better. The International Energy Agency, which is one of the best in the business in terms of projecting oil prices, has said that they anticipate oil coming back up to $80 by the end of the decade. And I think we'll see some progress toward that, even by the end of this year. How low they'll go? That's a good question. What we've got is a huge amount of surplus, both production and now oil and storage, and we have to work that off. And just like if you and I had a manufacturing plant and we'd manufactured too many widgets and the widget market wasn't taking them all, we wanted to get them off the shelves. We dropped the price pretty fast, pretty hard to get them off the shelves and get our factory back in operation. Oil may go back into the 20s. It may go deep into the 20s, but we need to keep in mind that's a temporary phenomena, because as oil goes down like that, it's taking off investment. People aren't making new investment in new oil wells, in new oil development projects, and that ultimately leads to bringing the market back in balance, as the IEA has said, toward the end of the decade, back up to the $80 range.
All right, fair enough. Brad, thanks for being here today, and hopefully we'll be able to tap into the mental resources that are Brad Keithley in the future.
Chris, thanks for having me. I always enjoy it.
All right, thank you. And don't go anywhere. We'll summarize and wrap up and talk Alaskan Mindbender when we return here to Alaska Matters Radio.